Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center's event, Public Outrage, a look at protest movements in Iran and the Arab world. I'm Marissa Khurma, Director of the Middle East Program here at the Wilson Center. I'm truly honored to moderate this discussion with the founder of the Middle East Program and distinguished fellow Haleh Esfandiari, and MEP fellow and author of many books, the most recent being A Tale of Four Worlds, the Arab Region After the Uprisings, Marina Ottaway. The widespread protests that we are seeing unfolding on the streets across Iran that followed the death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman from the Kurdish region, is yet another wave the Islamic Republic is witnessing. While the initial protests were led by women and focused on women's freedoms and specifically the hijab or the headscarf, they quickly evolved to protests against the Islamic Republic and its theocratic conservative rule, akin to other waves that we have seen in Iran since 2009. Similarly, the Arab world has also seen waves of protest movements calling for change that kicked off in Tunisia in 2010, right after a street vendor, Mohammed Bouazizi, set himself on fire. And we've seen that reverberate elsewhere across the Arab world, from Egypt to Libya to Yemen to Syria. And yet another wave in 2018 and 2019 in Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, and Lebanon. There are parallels to be drawn and patterns to be highlighted with a closer look, a closer comparative look at protest movements in Iran and the Arab world. That is the core of our discussion today with two leading experts from within the Wilson Center family. So Haleh and Marina, welcome, and thank you so much for your time. And before we kick off this discussion, to our audience watching or listening, we invite you to submit questions using the chat feature on the event webpage, or you can tweet to @WilsonCenterMEP. So Haleh, I'm gonna start with you to perhaps give us a bit of an overview of where the protests are. We're about a month in now since the death of Mahsa Amini and the first protests that erupted. And how significant are these developments within the larger context of what's happening in the country? How different is this wave from others that we have seen?
Okay.
Right.
Look, the length of the protest movement took us and everybody by surprise. Usually in the past, when there were such protest movement, whether it was for economic reason or political reason or for the excesses of the government, after a couple of days, it would just end. And the reason has always been that the government goes after any protest movement, any demonstration with total brutality. They use the forces. This time, I think the big difference was that the protest movement was led by women. And this was the first time in the history of the Islamic Republic that women came out protesting directly, not only to what had happened to Mahsa Amini, that everybody by now knows, that because she was showing a bit of hair and was not dressed the way they expected her to dress, so they arrested her and they beat her to death. And when she was sent to the hospital, according to the first report of the hospital, which was then changed, she was brain dead when she arrived there. So that was the trigger point. I mean, women and across the country came out, and it was very interesting that the second day, women were inviting men to join them, you know, and they would say in Isfahan, it started in Isfahan, they would shout, Hamrah sho, come and join us, you know. And I suppose at that point, Iranian men decided this is terrible to see the women leading and they are sitting at home. So they joined them. Vanity, I think, was more rather than they would care for whether women wear a scarf or not. But there was another incident 42 years ago when the mandatory hijab was imposed on women in Iran. Again, women came out. But at that time, it was the middle class women who came out because they were the women who were employed during the previous regime and had jobs and were participating in all the affairs of the state. So they were out in the street. But this time, it is the children of the revolution. These are young people, 18 to 24, 18 to 25, who grew up and were indoctrinated by this regime and they prove that they are not interested at all in the system. They are fed up with it. And there was, if I quote one of the demonstrators, she said, I want to live like young people live in New York. And somebody asked me, how do they know about New York? I said, where were you? I mean, they are connected and they follow all the development across, the world, and they want to be one of them. So I just think that this time, the reason why it has taken so long, it no longer is about the hijab. It started with the hijab. But the reason is that people are sick and tired with corruption. People are sick and tired with the economic situation. Cost of living is, rising on a daily basis. I talk to friends in Iran, and even middle-class people can barely manage with one salary, two salaries, three salaries. So it's a combination of everything. And I just don't see that they will go back to their homes in the foreseeable future. The government is using maximum brutality. They are killing. They have now several thousand people in their prisons. And the Evin story is a different story, and worse than anything else, they are now rounding up children, from elementary school, middle schools, high schools. High school kids usually take part in demonstrations, but elementary school and middle school, and are taking them into re-education centers, which we had never had in the past in Iran. And parents are frantically going from one place to another place to find out what is happening to their children. This is what is happening. But regarding, Marina will talk now about the Arab uprisings and the Arab Spring, but we should always remember that the Iranian people voted with their feet and went to the ballot and voted for the establishment of the Islamic Republic. If there was one election in the history of Iran that was not tampered with, was the referendum to establish the Islamic Republic. So this is the doing of that generation 43 years ago. And now we have another generation who can't take it anymore.
And it seems that, as you said, because the regime is using maximum brutality, that they are still going out and still mobilizing, and so the fear barrier has also been broken.
Oh yes, I think they are. If women would stop coming out in the street, the men would be very happy to stay home. But women are not. They are not. I'm not being facetious, and really this is the fact. They come out in the street of their daughters to go out. You know, that is, I mean, there was a story that a woman, a young girl told her mother, look, I'm going, I know I might get killed, but it is worth it. I would like to do it for the others. So this is the sense of, you know, this emotional feeling that exists among the younger generation, that maybe we can take matter into our hand when it comes to changing the system. But I just don't want to be gloom and doom, but I don't think it will happen so easily.
Well, things are still unfolding on the ground, so it's definitely a wait and see situation. Marina, I want to turn to you to basically give us a glimpse of how you see what's happening in Iran and what parallels there are, if any, with the waves of uprisings that we've seen in the Arab world. There were, you know, young people as well. Maybe women were more of a feature in the second wave. But how do you see, how do you compare the waves that Iran has seen, not just this one, but, you know, since 2009 and before that, and the Arab uprisings that erupted in 2010? You're on mute, just unmute yourself, kindly.
There are definitely very strong similar protests that started in this case about the hijab in the Arab countries, you know, the fruit vendor that was insulted by the policewoman, sort of seemingly fairly trivial incidents. I'm not saying that the hijab was trivial, but very often there is a fairly trivial incident that triggers it, but then they become, what comes out is the rage against the regime. And that, you know, they really come into, turn into anti-government demonstrations. I think we have seen everywhere, the Arab world has now had two waves of protest. And protesters have become increasingly sophisticated. And particularly, they become fairly good at stretching on the protest for a long period of time. They have learned from earlier on. For example, in the case of Egypt, you know, you had massive protests in Tahrir Square at the beginning. It did not last very long because then the government overthrew Mubarak and it never went back to the street. I mean, there were other street protests, but never on that same level. We looked at Algeria, and the protest in Algeria was 10 years late, almost 10 years later. And what we see is that they were able to sustain a good level of protest for over a year. So, and then it was so because they had learned to pace themselves, not to try to call on everybody to come out at the same time. There was a degree of planning, rather informal, but there was a degree of planning to stretch it on. The problem is that even these prolonged protests don't necessarily lead anywhere. Because in order for the protest to really to come to a change of government, and particularly to a change, not so much the specific government, but a change of regime, a change of system. Because, you know, the government fell in Egypt, and then you had another system that was pretty much a carbon copy of it. So that, but in order to have a real change, you need an organization that will bring about the change. And unfortunately, that's the real conundrum of all these movements, that organized movements are very easy for the government to suppress. You can decapitate them. If there is a clear leader, you manage to arrest that leader or to kill that leader and so on. And the movement, the protesters shun the idea of organizing in a coherent way, because they say if we have, and they talk about it openly. If you did, I had many discussions with some of these groups and say, no, if you have an organization, if you have a leader, the government takes it out. It's better to have loose networks of organizations connected by, they often emphasize social media. All the studies show that more than social media, information goes around by word of mouth in the very old-fashioned way.
We're just losing.
But in any case, so they make that choice of not organizing for very good reasons, but without the organization, nothing happens. And if you look, if you look historically, I have taken a quick look, and very superficial by definition, but if you look at the great revolutions, the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and so on, the ones that really succeeded, for better or for worse, because I don't think the world was better off because the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution succeeded. But they were the ones that were highly organized, that had an organized political party behind it, and so on. The French Revolution, which was much more spontaneous and unorganized, essentially, in the end, did not last. I mean, it brought about the changes in French society. But it was not long before the so because there was not the organization behind you that it could support. So what we are looking is a real conundrum for all these countries that are in the throes of trying to bring about a change, that loosely organized movements can last more easily, but they really cannot close the deal, in a sense, cannot bring about the change that they want.
So if we are to just zoom into that issue of leadership and organization in particular, then how is it that we've seen other successful models, for example, in Latin America? I remember when we were chatting, I asked you, well, if the groups and movements in the Arab world or in Iran are unable to organize because the price is really high and the regime is adaptive and uses all sets of tools to suppress and ensure that this doesn't happen, then so what is the pathway to change? Like in the case of Sudan, there were some changes that took place, and so what are some of the ingredients for change to happen, not just through protest but through organizing?
The case of Sudan is interesting because in a way it proves what I was saying, because the Sudan, you had the typical street protest that arose spontaneously. When these things started really happening is when the professional syndicates, the lawyers associations, the engineers association, that have a long history of political intervention in Sudan, took over the leadership of the movement. And they were able to come together, and because there was some organization, they were able to negotiate with the military. It's very much a touch and go, the situation there. The military is always on the verge of taking back what it had conceded to the civilians, but it never quite succeeds, so that the movement is still alive for the time being. I will not say healthy, but it's alive. In the case of Latin America, it was very different because most of the big changes from dictatorship to more democratic system.
Marina, we're losing you. I think there's a bit of an issue with your connection. So can you hear us? Yeah, Marina's frozen. Hala, let me turn to you and perhaps zoom into the issue of organization and leadership, particularly that, as you mentioned, the regime is using maximum brutality and will not allow organization or any type of organization on the ground. But are there already established organizations that can be part of, mobilizing over the long term for change? You're on mute.
Let me take you a little bit back. Look, I believe one of the reasons why the Islamic revolution, the Islamic movement succeeded in Iran, first of all, it had a leader, not in Iran, but sitting in Iraq. And this was before social media and so on, but the country was inundated with tapes from Ayatollah Khomeini. And also they had the network of mosques and the network of clerics. Mm-hmm. Also, it was an Islamic revolution, which was new for the people of Iran. You see, because, it was new. And so there was this big organization on the one hand, and there was this novelty of an Islamic revolution for them on the other hand. So people gravitated to it. And the first two large marches they arranged across the country, especially in Tehran, was basically organized and run by the cleric with the help of political parties. Interestingly enough, under the previous regime, there were syndicates and there was a political party, and although they were not represented in parliament, the National Front, it existed there. It was clandestine, but it existed there. But the success of the revolution was also based on the moment all these different, the public sector and the private sector started, tuning in, started working with the revolutionaries. You saw strikes in government offices. People would go to their jobs, but would not work, would just sit there, or the National Iranian Oil Company went on strike. The tankers went on strikes. You had big organizations. The labor union went on strike. So the country was paralyzed by this. Therefore, I think these people who are now running the government, the Islamists, the current is government, they have learned a lot of lessons from the past. And the moment they see a strike, they go in and they put an end to it. And, there are, quote unquote, the teachers' union, for example, the workers, the labor union, but, they are controlled. And what I find it admirable is despite all that control, that, for example, recently the teachers' union put out in the last couple of days a proclamation, protesting to the arrest of children. So whether there is a leadership now or not, it's hard to tell, but there is something is going on, Marina and Marissa, and that is, these protests are organized. When they come out at, let's say, 6 o'clock in the afternoon, when it starts getting dark, or 7 o'clock, and they come out across the country. And I think this is thanks to social media. And no leader will come out, no leader in Iran will come out now because they know what will happen. The last time in 2009, when we had the Green Movement, the leader was a former prime minister of the Islamic Republic, Mir Hossein Mousavi, and a former speaker of parliament, Karoubi. They are still, I mean, Mousavi is still under house arrest, you see. So they know what will happen to them. There must be somewhere a leadership which sort of sends out this, but we don't know where they are.
Mm-hmm. And Marina, if we were to turn to the Arab world to look at some of those dynamics with regards to, I mean, you mentioned Sudan and the professional associations, but what about political parties, labor unions, or others who have not necessarily been part of a protest wave, but have come out at different sporadic moments to also call for changes within their own sectors or, you know, within their own communities? How does that look like in the Arab world? And is, you know, if we see more frequent activity amongst these more organized groups that are part and parcel of the ecosystem, are we more likely to see more protest movements taking place that are more organized? You're on mute.
Okay. The political parties in the Arab world are pretty hopeless organized. The only ones that were truly organized were the Islamist parties. And it's not by accident that they took over in so many countries at the beginning. There has been a huge crackdown on Islamist movements everywhere, so that they are in disarray. They are not going to be the same, play the same role. Labor unions played a huge role in Tunisia. I would say that I would argue that the initial success of the uprising in Tunisia was totally due to again that the current president, the labor unions have not budged. There have been changes in the leadership. They could still play a very important role because they have a very large membership, but they are not. If we go back for a moment to what I was trying to say when the internet let me down, in the case of the Latin American countries, one very important factor in the change was the fact that the popular discontent triggered divisions within.
We lost you again, Marina.
Within the government, within the country's leadership. And there is nothing I can do about it. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can. Yes, we can hear you now. So go ahead.
So these divisions within the leadership, the split within the leadership, did allow change to take place. Now, one question about Iran, and I don't think we really have an answer because we have not seen it. What are the possibilities that will be splits either within the leadership of the country? And here, perhaps I should turn it over to Hale.
Hale, if you can unmute yourself kindly. Hale, you're unmuted.
No, I'm just.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So far, we have not seen a division in the leadership. You know, one usually expected that at least the high-ranking ayatollahs who are based in Qom would come and side with the people. We have, with an exception of two ayatollahs in the very beginning who came out and they said that, you know, the moral police shouldn't be on the streets. That was the limit of intervention. And we haven't seen anybody in parliament, not a single member of parliament so far, to, say something about these excesses of the government. We haven't seen that. On the contrary, those who have spoken have supported the moral police, have supported the security, set up the security police. So we haven't seen that. But we also have not seen a split, or at least some sort of intervention, verbal intervention on behalf of the people by the Revolutionary Guards who are just now on the streets, or the paramilitary Basij and the other groups, So I think Marina is very right that if there is going to be a change, we would need first a split in the government. So people to come out, in the government, member of parliament, cabinet, advisor to the supreme leader, and the clerical community to just try and restrain what goes on in Iran. No, we haven't seen that. If there is a talk going on among them, I don't know.
Thank you, Hale. So I'm going to start asking some of the questions that have been flowing in from our audience. And the first one is from our fellow Stephen King, which is actually very much related to the point that you were making about splits within political ranks, but particularly the military. So Stephen's asking, in the Arab Spring uprisings where serious protests erupted, regime survival ultimately turned on the question, would the military defect or commit mass casualties for regime survival? So if we can get, I guess, comments from both of you. I know, Hale, you touched upon this a little bit, but Marina, with the Arab uprisings, the military played an important role, but what way, if we were to see another wave, what way would it turn to? Defect or commit mass casualties for its own survival?
Yes, well, in most countries, that had uprising, the military survived. Take the case of Egypt. The military remained in control from day one. We were all bamboozled for a while because the military decided to play the game of democracy for 1 year. They allowed the elections, they allowed even a Muslim brother to become president of Egypt. Although they
You're frozen again, Marina. We'll just give you a few seconds because it comes back. Hale, shall we turn to you? I know you were just talking about this, but perhaps answer the question sort of in the more long term. Do you see the military defecting?
Yeah, and then Marina, as soon as you can talk and so on, cut me off so that you finish what you were saying. Look, what happened under the previous regime on the eve of the revolution, the army announced its neutrality. But so the people were able to take over the barracks and took the guns and everything which was there, and within 48 hours after the success of the revolution, you had revolutionary committees on every corner of every street in every city and town and the capital across Iran. So they were very well organized. Mm-hmm. But what happened was that the revolutionary government, despite the army announcing its neutrality, arrested all the commanders,
Mm.
executed most of them, or put them in jail. So therefore, the image of the executions of the commanders is a lesson for the Revolutionary Guard commanders, that if they, if they announce their neutrality, I mean, if it comes to that point, this is what is maybe in stock for them. So therefore, and the Revolutionary Guard really was formed by the Islamic Republic, because in those days they didn't trust the army, although the army was fighting for them in the Iran-Iraq war, when it started. So they are the support of the government. And, I still can't envisage a moment where they will break away, unless they break away, but they come, like in Egypt, you will have a military government in Iran. That's the way I see it, But it is, all these are, Marissa, speculations.
Of course.
Because the way things are developing in Iran, personally, I don't know how long they are going to continue arresting and killing people. I just can't, I don't know. There must come a point where they would stop, and they have lost all their legitimacy.
So I think this is a good opportunity to ask this question that came from one of our audience members, which is, at what point does the international community do something? And what role does the international community play in supporting the protests, the protesters, but also ensuring that the regime is held accountable for using maximum brutality and killing its own people?
I don't think there is a history of interference by outside powers whenever there are demonstrations and protest movement in the countries. But what is different this time is, because it is a protest movement led by women, and it has sustained it for almost 5 weeks. Therefore, you have a lot of support from the international community. So far, it is verbal. What else can they do? They are supporting them. Or, what is also, I think, is new, is that the different human rights organizations in different countries all are trying to condemn the brutality. In a way, it is heartwarming for the protesters in Iran, because they don't think they are forgotten. But on the other hand, the government continues with its excesses, with the killing. So I just think that probably the West must decide to do something. I don't know, maybe cut off relations, maybe recall their ambassadors, something, like they did. And there is a history in Iran. I believe when the fatwa was announced against Salman Rushdie, I think some of the European countries withdrew their ambassadors. And also when a mob attacked the British embassy in Tehran, again, a number of European countries recalled their ambassadors. So I think this is, to me, this is maximum they can do. But what the United States can do now is to make sure that the internet connection, the social media is restored for Iran, because this is the lifeline. But nevertheless, full of admiration for the protesters, they managed to send out these videos all the time. all the time you have, even if it is 1 minute, 2 minutes, they send it out. And we have, once again, like 2009, we have citizen journalism. Everybody who has a cell phone sends out a story or a video.
And that generation, they're all digital natives, so they do find ways around basically any barriers. Marina, I'm going to ask you the same question that I had asked Ali that came from our audience, because it also involved the Arab world, which is, what role does the international community play in supporting or exacerbating the work of protests in the Middle East? I'm going to add another component to the question that also just came in, that a lot of the influential foreign powers tend to finance, sometimes house opposition leadership, organizing to overturn basically regimes in their home countries. So does this happen often? Have we seen it in the Arab world?
Well, first of all, let me apologize with the problem I'm having with the line. I work from home because usually the internet is better here than at the office. This is not the case. This is not the case this morning. I think, very frankly, we in the international community delude ourselves that we can do something to really change the course of these uprisings. These are domestic uprisings. You know, we can offer encouragement. We tell them we are with you. Well, that does not do very much, right? There is very little we can do concretely. In the case of a war, we can provide weapons, but in a case of something of this sort, there is very little that we can do. And we both try to take too much credit when things succeed, like the color revolution in Eastern Europe, where the United States and other Western countries had very little to do with them, but took credit nevertheless, which I think it was not a particularly good move. Or we decry the fact that we did not do more. I just finished reading an article on Tunisia that said if only the West had provided more help, Tunisia would not be in the situation it is now. So we can do very little. Yes, we can offer shelter and we can offer probably some monetary help to the movements in exile. That does not necessarily work. First of all, because people in exile are not always the real leaders. They are not, often they lose contact. But also we have a very important cautionary tale about the danger of supporting movements in exile, and that's Iraq. The United States for a long time supported the Iraqi National Congress. People were based here in Washington. We did all sorts of work on their behalf. We believe what they were telling us. And they went back, and it turned out that they had no support whatsoever inside the country. So that, it takes a lot of knowledge to interfere in the domestic politics of a country. Leave out for a moment the moral issue, should we do or not do it? But it takes a lot more knowledge that we have in most cases. And I cannot think of too many. Look at another Cuba and the Bay of Pega, the debacle. I mean, so that it's not clear to me how is it that the West could really give true support to these organizations that would make a difference in the ground, rather than, the usual problem, we are with you and so on. Does that encourage people if they hear Washington saying we are with you? I don't know. I'm not there, but I think a lot of people also probably think it's a very hypocritical.
And then in the same spirit, another question that came in that's related, going back to the accountability factor. Do you think the United Nations will probe Iran's crackdown on protests, or perhaps, where they happen elsewhere in the MENA region? Hale? You're still on mute.
Unmuting it. Okay. I don't know much about what the United Nations can do, whether they can make announcements, they can pass resolutions, whether it's going to affect that country or not, I don't know. And what basically, but the more people, I think the more people talk about the violation of human rights in Iran, the more institutions talk about violation of human rights in Iran, the better. What I'm concerned now, and is that the next thing we will see are mass trials in Iran. We saw it in 2009. I mean, they have to try and stop that from happening by starting the legitimizing it now. That is what governments can do. That is what the UN can do, to try to delegitimize this and to try and bring pressure that all political prisoners, all prisoners who were taken in the last 5 weeks and are part of political prisoners should be freed, or all the children they have. I mean, can you imagine a child at the age of 10 or 12 being a political prisoner?
Yeah.
And this is the kind of pressure they should bring on Iran. That is.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Hale. A question to you, Marina, since Hale spoke about the the protests in Iran, namely the current wave led by women and men joining out of reluctance. What are the gender dynamics of protests that we've also witnessed in the Arab world?
It was not the participation of women, unfortunately, in the Arab world was not a determinant factor. Yes, they did participate. I think it's important to state that clearly and so on. But it was not, the protests in the Arab world, by and large, were not driven by women. So it's a very different situation, partly because none of them was triggered by an issue that affected women, specifically like the issue of the hijab. So I think it's somewhat different.
What about the youth factor? Because headlines, in 2011, 2012, across the Western media, were all about how youth led the protests, whether it's in Tunisia or it's in Egypt. But then, more than 10 years later, looking back and assessing how things moved forward, it was a different story.
Well, youth always are the first ones to come out in the streets. They are the ones who have the energy. They don't have creaky joint like their elder and so on and so forth. And they have the energy to go out. And also they are a bit more reckless, probably. They don't have, the responsibility that weigh heavily on older people, family responsibility and so on. So the participation of youth in street movements is a given in any country. It's not a cultural factor or anything of that sort. It's just a function of age. I don't think that means that the youth then have the capacity and the organization, and this goes back to leadership and organization, to really lead the street movements to a conclusion.
Yeah, and that ties back to your earlier comments about the importance of organizing and how do you organize on the ground. Yeah. Another question that came in from our audience, also related, going back to structuring these movements. So the need of organized movement often starts with the readiness of people for a change, that is how people gravitate to a new political idealism for a hope of change. Would you think the continued protest of women of Iran resulting in forming a leadership or structuring this movement? I think Hale, you've touched upon this. But if we see these protests continuing, will we see women structuring new groups or new organizations to lead?
To me, was your question? Well, the Iranian women have a much older history in participating in political movement, than I think in large number. I mean, the first time they came out in the street was in 1905, 1906, alongside, they demonstrated along men to remove an autocratic monarchy for a constitutional monarchy. And over the decades, every time there has been a political movement in Iran, women have been part of it, but never they were never in the leadership, They were always, they are used to come out into the streets. But I think two things happened after the Islamic Revolution, which made women so much more politically motivated and also angry. And what we see now is the accumulation of 43 years of frustration. And the reason was that the women who took part in the demonstrations that led to the establishment of the Islamic Republic really wanted an expansion of their rights. They had a lot of rights before the revolution, both on the personal status law and in political participation. So it really, and they were educated. So I was looking at an article I wrote many, many years ago last night, and I came across a sentence that an Iranian woman I interviewed after the revolution told me. She said, before the revolution, if my boss would tell me, go and move the Alborz mountains, which are surrounding Tehran, I would not tell him how, I would say when. So this was the mentality and the way the women felt before the revolution. And they participated because they thought, okay, we will get more rights, more rights, more rights. But after the revolution, it didn't take long. Within the first year, the mandatory hijab on one side, they lost all their rights. They're in the family protection law, and that's a different story, I mean, just to give you two examples, they lost the right to seek a divorce. They lost they needed the permission even for their husband to leave their domicile. Plus, the age of marriage for girls was reduced from 18 to 9. So, and the government toyed with the idea of barring women from some fields at the universities, and it took many years for activist women to fight that. So women in Iran have a history of being part of the political movement. And in political parties in Iran, the ones that were there was always a women branch, whether it was the Communist Party, the Tudeh Party, later on the Rastakhis Party, the National Front Party. They were always women, but not in the leadership, except I think there was one woman in the Politburo of the Rastakhis Party. But they were there, they were active. So, there is this history of women participating, which I'm not so sure whether it exists in the Arab world. And I think they came out this time because they were sick and tired of the men not doing anything for them.
Thank you, Hale. So one question to Marina, and then we're going to wrap this up with final thoughts. Is there any benefit for other countries in the region, Arab countries in the region, seeing what's happening in Iran, continuing slowly to undermine Iran's state legitimacy? Will it revive, and that's something that I would add, will it revive other protest movements across the region, particularly given the economic hardships that many communities and many societies are experiencing?
Well, if there is something, sure, the conditions exist in most Arab countries for flare-ups of popular unrest. There is no doubt about that. One thing that we have learned from the early uprisings is that we really don't know how to predict when and where it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
That there is, the triggers are so unpredictable. The unfolding is so unpredictable. You don't know who is there. Let me give you an example. We all know that the self-immolation of the Tunisian fruit vendor is usually given as the trigger of all the Arab protest movement, the Arab Spring, if you want. What most people don't know is that earlier that same year, there had been 3 other self-immolations in Tunisian towns that essentially, got a brief mention in the newspaper and nothing happened. So it's you cannot say, if such and such happens, then the movement will revive again. It really depends. In the case of Tunisia, it was that in this case, the labor union decided to intervene and to do something. And they were the ones who took the protest, particularly the teachers' union to begin with, and then other unions, took the protest from this little town in the middle of nowhere all the way down to the capital, to the provincial capitals, and then to Tunis itself. So yes, it can happen, but whether or not it will happen, I think it depends on a lot of things that I really would not dare to predict, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely difficult to predict. With a few minutes left, I just want to, I guess, ask you to, wrap up this discussion with final thoughts from both of you. Basically, how they're looking at what's happening now. What are 2 things that we should be looking out for as we continue to watch the political developments in Iran?
Marissa, I want to be very brief and just give you one sentence. I think I'm in awe of what the younger women, especially the young women in Iran, have achieved and are doing. And I'm happy to be around to have watched that the torch has passed and it is in very good hands. And we will hear more and more about Iranian women in the next decades to come. That's it.
Thank you, Hale. And Marina, looking at what's happening in Iran, but also looking back at the Arab uprisings, what are 2 lessons learned, perhaps that you can highlight that make that parallel with what we're seeing today?
Well, I think the first lessons is most uprisings don't lead to a revolution. And most attempted revolutions do not succeed.
Mm-hmm.
Whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, it's arguable, because unfortunately, revolutions tend to lead to very authoritarian regimes. Look at Russia, look at China, look at Iran. Because for the reason we have said, the revolutions that succeed are the ones where there is a new leadership and a new organization in the waiting. And those organizations are usually not, they tend to be authoritarian because they have to be tightly organized in order to and on the ground. So I think we have to I'm not saying giving up on the idea, but we have to be more careful about becoming too enthusiastic about the possibility that the street movements will lead to real change. You were asking Hale what we should be looking out for, and I think in the case of Iran and on any other situation where an uprising is taking place, we really should look for signs that there are splits within the incumbent leadership, because that is probably in the end what is going to make a difference. If can we do something to facilitate from the outside to facilitate those splits? I doubt it, because also one of the problems of the Americans of the West intervening is that we delegitimize any group that we support in that sense. But probably the most likely source of change is going to come not from the street movements, but from a split on the leadership, or from the street movements triggering a split within the leadership.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you, Halis Fendayari and Marina Ottaway, for being with us today. Thanks to all of you watching and your questions, and tune in for more MEP events in the next few weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.